Well, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on Left Reckoning. My name is David. I'm joined, as always, by Matt, and we're very, very excited to be joined today by Meagan Day, who's a staff writer at Jacobin. She's the writer of the great book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, and the author of this really great piece in Jacobin that caught our eye, There Once Was a Socialist College in the Rural South. How are you doing today, Meagan?
I'm doing great. I'm excited that you guys want to talk about this piece. I had a lot of fun researching and writing it.
Well, it's one of those things that's just right up our alley. I mean, history, talking about socialist movements in the South. You know, one thing that we've really been focusing on the past couple of weeks on the show is trying to push back against the kind of flat view of history that it's very popular with a lot of American lefties today, where you recognize that, this is an empire. It's built on the history of genocide and slavery and all these terrible things. But if you only pay attention to that, you'll miss that throughout all of American history, there have been struggles to build a very different future, and recognizing the pitfalls of those movements, but also that they were very purposefully, smashed down so that we could never learn from them. We don't think of them as a part of our history today. Is very much a project of the right. And there's so many things that are really critical for us to learn from a lot of these movements, both, negatives and a lot of positives too. And especially understanding, I think, as we're starting to build a movement, post Bernie, knowing that we're not the first lefties to ever exist in the United States, which means that there are a lot of tendencies and habits that we fall into that unfortunately have been repeated in the past. But anyways, that's enough for me. I wanted to know, why were you interested in this college? How did it sort of come across your radar?
Well, people who are following what's happening in the Jacobin universe might be aware that Sean Goody is in the process of writing a new biography of Eugene Debs. So he's constantly uncovering things that are adjacent to that. And sometimes he has ideas for pieces in Jacobin that are sort of corresponding to his research. So he came across Commonwealth College, and he just said, I think that we should have a piece on this. It's actually kind of a big deal. So I cracked open the major. There's really only one sort of monograph. It's by William H. Cobb. It was published, I want to say, in the 90s, and just started to do some research of my own. And it grew. I mean, I was going to do like a 1,000 to 2,000 word piece. It's significantly longer because I started to learn, not only is this incredibly interesting, but there are a lot of lessons, like you alluded to, that are contained in this story. And another thing that I think is really interesting is that it in an unusual way actually sort of captures the moment when Debsian socialism gives way to Communist Party branded socialism in the United States. And for socialists who are somewhat familiar with American socialist history, you might know that those two things were dominant strains at different times. But we tend to think of them as being separate. First there was one and then there was the other. The truth of the matter is that there were real people who were existing in the years when one became the other, and they had lots of debates that looked really similar to our debates, and they had subjectivities that were similar to ours. They had, they would experience things like bruised egos, and they would change their minds on important questions, and thus, losing important alliances with comrades, things that we're familiar with today. So just to get a very human look at what it was like to experience the changing of the guard between, Debsian Socialist Party socialism to, American Communist Party socialism in the United States was one of the reasons why I really wanted to write it.
I was interested in, you write about Debsian socialism, that it's sort of a descendant from American utopian socialism, sort of mid-19th century. And I'm very fascinated by that period personally because, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a book called The Blithedale Romance about something called the Brookdale Farm I had it up here, the Brookdale Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education. And I find that sort of, that utopian socialist era very interesting. And I kind of submerged. It wasn't until I was basically a professional leftist propagandist that I actually revisited this history. Can you just talk about that, how that led into Debsianism a little bit?
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Before there was Marxist socialism there were other types of socialism. I think that new converts to socialism don't necessarily know that. It's important to know. One of them was, I guess you could say, pre-Marxist revolutionary communism, which tended to be very vanguardist. It was like, me and 10 guys are going to overthrow the French government on Thursday. Like, see you there. And then another one was utopian socialism, like the idea that you were going to plan out these prefigurative communities and then populate them with well-meaning people, and maybe even appeal to the capitalist class for funds to sustain them. And that was how you were going to prove that socialism was viable and in everybody's interest. Marx and Engels' intervention essentially is, on the one hand, they're saying to the utopian socialists, like, you just think you need to change everybody's minds, and then we'll have socialism. And that's not how it's going to work. We're going to have to do class struggle. And to the revolutionary communists, Marx and Engels are saying, it can't just be you and 10 guys. We're going to have to get the entire working class on board. We're going to have to do mass politics, right? But socialism took off in the United States before this kind of Marxist intervention in the middle of the 19th century. And so there were a lot of planned communities. There were communes in the United States that were intended to demonstrate that socialism could be real and viable in practice. And that is an American tradition of socialism that runs very strong. In the mid 19th century, you saw a new wave of immigration in New York City, Chicago, some of these big cities from Eastern Europe, also Western Europe, from places where Marx's ideas were popular, where Marxist socialism was popular. People like Eugene Debs, sort of ended up inheriting an amalgamation of these ideas. From the utopian socialists, what they took was a very strong Americanism, almost like a pastoral sensibility, a kind of American heartland ethos. Upstanding, citizens of such and such town in Kansas would come out to hear the Debsian socialists give these rousing speeches that were quite similar in tone to what they would hear from their preachers on Sunday, right? So that's the sort of more American socialist, utopian socialist derived tradition. But Debs also certainly was Marxist. He was a great admirer of Kautsky and some of the people who were continuing, his contemporaries who were continuing the Marxist tradition in Europe, and certainly emphasized the idea of class struggle, the way that Marx did, mass class struggle, the way that Marx did. So that's Debsian socialism in a nutshell. You could say sort of that it has a Marxist socialist intellectual legacy, but its cultural legacy is a little more similar to the kind of bucolic or pastoral American heartland socialists that came before the Marxist interventions. Debsian socialism was really hot in the prairie. It was a big deal in Girard, Kansas, which was its headquarters for a while. And Commonwealth College was founded by Debsian socialists who, in fact, met in Girard, Kansas, where they were a part of. There was a magazine called The Appeal to Reason that was like the big Socialist Party adjacent magazine at the time, sort of encapsulating this Debsian tradition. Debs wrote for it, and they had people contributing to it who were kind of dubbed the Appeal Army. And a couple of people who were in that army, the Appeal Army, they decided that they wanted to found a college. Yeah, that's right. #Appeal Army. And they decided they wanted to found Commonwealth College. And so that's where the college comes from, is directly out of that tradition.
Yeah, and let's sort of lay it bare for folks. Commonwealth College was founded in Arkansas, right? I believe in Western Arkansas, with the goal at first of providing a liberal arts education to working class people, because traditionally that had been something that had been denied to working people. And I just want to make a side note. This is another great lesson about one of the first things that good socialist organizations or socialist parties have done historically has been to provide people with education in this kind of general sense. You look throughout a lot of socialist history of the 20th century, these were big parts of the socialist ideal to sort of wrestle away control of knowledge and history and literature from just one class of class of folks. Could you talk a little bit about the founding in the early days? And also, I really love the application process to the school compared to what we have to do today.
Right. Yeah. So when they founded Commonwealth College, they searched for a home for it for a while. They sort of dabbled in Louisiana for a second, and then they ended up in Arkansas. The idea was to provide a general liberal arts education. So students would be assigned both classical texts that they would have no other means of encountering elsewhere in their life. The students were supposed to be workers. I think this is important to lay out at the outset. Yeah. The idea of Commonwealth College was that the students would ideally be older than traditional students, and that they would already have some work experience, and that they would take the lessons from Commonwealth back to their working class worlds and milieus or the shop floor, and that they would then put what they had learned they would put it to work in service of the socialist movement and the labor movement. That was the idea. As for the pedagogical philosophy, the idea was that they would get a traditional liberal arts education that would allow them to understand the interplay of social forces, so that they would then be able to bring a degree of, wisdom and intelligence, a sort of native intelligence to the struggles that were happening wherever they came from. So it wasn't just completely utopian. It wasn't just like, we're going to teach them, the beautiful ideas and then they will be more devoted and committed. It really was a sense that the ruling class gave a liberal arts education to its progeny, which was actually very beneficial for them because they understood how the world worked, how it fit together. And those are lessons that you need to study history, study literature, study math and physics and science in order to understand how the world works and have confidence maneuvering in it. So the idea was that working class people could also develop that confidence. So a liberal arts education was the original idea. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, they're getting this education too, but this isn't a university that's being funded by a bunch of wealthy folks, right? This was very much a community project to both educate folks, but also to maintain the space, the food, and all of this as well.
That's right. A part of the holistic education would also, in the utopian socialist tradition, would be to live in a communal fashion and to do chores with each other. And that included faculty and students doing chores alongside each other in many cases. And it's important to note that because the students were a little bit older and the faculty tended to be a little bit younger, there was actually not a huge age difference between students and faculty a lot of times. And they were also working on, these chore duties together to keep the place running. The faculty were not paid salaries. They were paid room and board. And so there was it was not a traditional student teacher dynamic. And in fact, William Cobb writes that sometimes the political discussions in classes would sort of devolve into fights between students and teachers that resembled barroom confrontations, he said, because people were quite casual. Every evening they would have meals. The meals were often made with very humble food that they had grown, they had cooked themselves, and then they would take that as an occasion to discuss community business. So it really was, and faculty and students alike would participate in an egalitarian fashion in those discussions. There was an administration. It was not, entirely horizontal, but that comes to play later in terms of how the first conflicts arose at Commonwealth. But before we move on, I do want to read out the application process to get into Commonwealth. The idea is, first of all, they're just desperate for students, right? Because they're not, like you said, that their funding source. Well, they're not demanding like a lot of tuition money because they're trying to appeal to working people. It's barely anything, tuition money. And they do get some funding from the American Fund for Public Service, which is run by Roger Baldwin of the ACLU at the time. Wow. But it's not a ton of money. It's crucial for them, but it's not a ton of money. So they're desperate for students. The more students they can get, the more of their very, very meager tuition money they can get. And more importantly, the more hands they have to keep the place running, because they are doing all the work themselves. They're living in these rudimentary cabins, they're growing their own food, et cetera. So the application process is flexible. And it's really meant to just suss out if you're a socialist. And it goes, 1, tell what you think of one or more of the following men: Lenin, Mussolini, Wilson, Hoover, Ramsay MacDonald. 2, give your opinions on one of the following subjects: democracy, capitalism, socialism, Americanism, imperialism, anarchism. 3, what real significance do you see in the revolt of the so-called modern youth? How do you explain that revolt? This is important because this is 1931. So that wouldn't have been the application in the early years at Commonwealth College, which we'll get into. And then 4, tell a good joke, just to make sure that you have a sense of humor, just to make sure that you like to have fun, that you might be a nice person to go hiking in the mountains of Western Arkansas with. They would go hiking and go nude swimming, which was very scandalous, and pick berries and do weenie roasts in the mountains. And they played, volleyball and baseball, and they generally had a good time. So that was the application process.
And just we can keep talking, but I wanted to share some of these photographs too that we picked up because they're interesting. These are some students. I can look up the date in a second. Here's another photograph as well. And this is their college bell tower. So as you can see, very humble vibes there, nothing too fancy. But you can sort of get a sense as to what kind of a community it would have been there to not only, be living somewhat as equals with, your professors and staff, but also having a feeling of common ownership because it's you're maintaining the property, you're growing the food there as well. So that's the early days and early on, the community around them. How are they sort of viewed? I could imagine in Arkansas, a bunch of people from all over. And actually, before we get to that, so we talked about the class makeup of the students, but regionally, they were sort of pulling from all over the United States, correct?
Right. In fact, they kind of they struggled to get students from the South because the volunteers, people who really wanted to do this, who'd heard about it through whatever, movement infrastructure, were often from places like New York City and Chicago. And they wanted to include more people from the South. A very important note about the makeup of the student body is that no school at this point in Arkansas was racially integrated. And Commonwealth College wanted to be racially integrated, but they actually feared, because the situation was such that any integrated space, much less a college, would experience night riding by Klansmen, which would result in lynchings potentially. And so the school felt that they couldn't guarantee the safety of Black students. That said, there were forces on campus who were pushing for a faster integration. This is decades, by the way, before the Little Rock 9 crisis. So it would have been very advanced had they actually integrated. But some of the students said, look, maybe we should be the first school in all of the state of Arkansas to integrate. The administration thought, well, that's quite dangerous, but maybe we can invite some Black faculty, and that will sort of demonstrate our commitment to racial equality while also maybe being a little bit less taboo than a racially integrated school, right? And the Black faculty that they reached out to didn't want anything to do with it. Nobody would accept the post because it was too dangerous. So that's an important note. That's an important note. And it comes to play later, I think, in really important ways, because this story does actually become a story about race, racial integration, and racial violence, and essentially racial terrorism later. And did you have another question about those early days before we move on?
I mean, I was just sort of asking, early on, because I think it becomes important later, is that, they had some relationships with the community, particularly people like to show up to the dances and social events. But those relationships started to sour later, right?
Yeah. So here's what happened. At first, there were always some people who around Mena, Arkansas is the place. It's sort of near the Texas border. I'm not sure.
Oklahoma,
it's near the western border. Yeah, Oklahoma border. Thank you. The people in Mena some of them were circumspect, just because outsiders showing up. But honestly, the community relations were pretty good at first, in part because the commoners would hold these wonderful dances on Saturday nights. And it sounds just lovely to me, like people from, especially young people from nearby, they wanted to go dancing. So they would come to Commonwealth College to dance. And while there, they would perform these Southern square dances, and the kids from, I shouldn't say kids, they're in their 20s, the young people from, New York City would show them how they danced in New York City. Seems like a great time. There were, the students at Commonwealth were fascinated by folk music. And so they would invite local people to come to the college to play their music. I'm afraid I don't remember the name of the artist, but some of these became sort of immortalized, in, Smithsonian Folkways albums and things like that. They were very interested in the ethnomusicology of the region, the Commonwealth students. So they built ties to the community that way. Unfortunately, that they came to the attention of the broader community in Arkansas in 1926 in a way that was pretty damaging to the reputation of the school, which is that in 1926, the American Legion, which is a group of veterans, a conservative veterans group that had been founded about a decade earlier, or less than a decade earlier, as an alternative to the VFW, which was just getting a little too anti-war. So this was the pro-war veterans group. That's the purpose of them. And they had disrupted socialist activities all across the country for a decade. They caught wind of Commonwealth College in Arkansas. They didn't like it one bit. They accused of the college of being funded by red gold, i.e. by the Soviet Union. And they brought to the attention of everybody in Arkansas that they were, even though they weren't racially integrated, they were advocating racial equality, which was a big no-no. And then they also started talking about how people there, would go swimming naked and the women wore pants and there was free love happening. And it was sort of like free love Bolshevik scare happened around Commonwealth College in the 1920s. The school survived it, but a lot of the people in the region were kind of freaked out by some of what they had read in the press, some of the smears they had read, and specifically around student behavior. I mean, the school wasn't going to bend on certain things. They weren't going to bend on teaching racial equality, right? They weren't going to bend on the fact that they were socialists. But around the behavior, the administration, and remember, the administration is still these old Debsian socialists who like to give these barn burners in Girard, Kansas. I mean, they grew up, a lot of these people grew up in one-room homestead cabins. So it's not like they're not like 1920s flappers. So they might be personally a little bit uncomfortable with some of the things that the students are doing. And so the administration said, look, in order to repair our relationship with the people of Arkansas, you are going to have to stop drinking. You're going to have to stop having sexual relationships outside of marriage. And you're going to have to stop wearing shorts. Like for some reason, shorts was a big deal for both men and women. Like the administration was like, you need to wear regular length pants. So that was the first glimmer of conflict at Commonwealth College, because the students, these are the youth of the 1920s. There was a youth revolt, a cultural upheaval among American youth in the 1920s that rivaled the cultural upheaval of the late 1960s. And people don't really think about that, but it's true, right? And so the youth were like not happy with what the administration was telling them to do.
And all I was going to say was, and you could imagine that the people who are traveling across the country to go to some radical socialist college, they're not really the quiet types, right? They're not really the ones who are sort of, sitting around thinking about the youth revolts or anything like that. They're very much bringing that down with them.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is like the first, the very, very early days, but the college, I mean, it goes through all of these really distinct periods. So, we have the early stage, I think, sort of mapped out for us. What's the next stage? How does this sort of develop, over time?
So it's important to put this in context. What is happening in the cities that a lot of these students are coming from is the death of the Socialist Party and the rise of the Communist Party. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's pretty much the outline of things. And there's also just the rise of class struggle in general. I mean, there's a sort of new militancy at the end of the 1920s, are a pretty dark decade for the labor movement. The 1910s were very militant, lots of wildcat strikes, lots of things approaching sort of all out war. The roaring 20s are a little quieter. And then as we head into the 1930s, you're starting to see some new militancy and the class struggle kind of rearing its head once again. So because those things are happening, the young socialists are starting to think that maybe hiding out in Arkansas to read classical texts and grow food together is not the best use of anyone's time, and might even be a dereliction of duty to the class struggle, which I think is a very, very understandable position.
So a lesson the original utopian socialists learned, basically, I think.
It's actually so similar in a way to like in the 1840s and 50s, you start to see the utopian socialists get supplanted by the Marxists who had the Marxist immigrants in the big cities in the 50s, 60s, you know. And this is almost the exact same thing in microcosm. It's like they had a little revival of utopianism followed by another revival of like more, you know, class struggle oriented Marxism. Right. So the students are like starting to question the whole project. They love Commonwealth. They want to keep it alive, but they want it to be different. And in particular, this centers on a particular pedagogical debate that I think is probably the most, frankly, I think it's the most interesting part of this whole piece and this whole history, which is that the Debsian socialists, like I've said many times already, wanted to do a traditional liberal arts education to give workers the knowledge that had been taken from them. The new crop of student radicals wanted the school to be providing practical training for class struggle instead, so that people would come from the cities or wherever, and ideally from the countryside too. There was always like, let's get some farmers in here. It didn't really happen for a long time, but that was the goal. And to train people like to fulfill particular roles in the labor movement and in the socialist movement. So to have classes on like, we're going to train you to be a labor lawyer. We need lawyers for this movement. We're going to teach you law so that you can be a labor lawyer, or to train you in the art of activist journalism so that you can be a movement journalist, right? Because we need people doing that. To train people to just in the basics of organizing their shop. And this is probably the most important one, just like the guidelines of actually organizing the labor movement. So the idea was that, and also arts, this is important too. The new generation, they wanted to keep the arts. They didn't want to eliminate the arts, but they wanted to do what the old generation referred to as propaganda, which is not the same thing as just exploring the human capacity for creativity and plumbing the depths of the existential questions that face us all, right? The new students wanted to specifically do labor drama, and they did. They wrote these original plays, and eventually they ended up touring all around Arkansas and even out of the state, performing these plays that illustrated the core concepts of socialism for rapt audiences who loved them. So you can see that's the distinction between the liberal arts and sort of practical education and class struggle. This coupled with the whole no shorts attitude caused a big problem at Commonwealth. Eventually, what happened was that I think that it's a bit sad, actually. And I think that the Debsians who founded the college, they felt I think they were maybe getting older and they kind of wanted to retire and drift off campus. But I think they also felt like it wasn't their place anymore. This was their dream. This was their baby, and it was going to go its own way. And so they ended up kind of taking off and resigning. The person who took over the college was Lucian Coke, and he's an important character. Lucian Coke's parents had been original Commonwealth colonists. So and his parents were Debsian socialists. He was raised at Commonwealth. So we're going now into the 1930s, early 1930s. And he's like, Lucian Coke's all grown up and he's like been raised at Commonwealth, but he's meeting all these radical students. So he agrees with them, but he also knows Commonwealth inside and out and loves it. And so he takes over the college and facilitates the radical turn at Commonwealth College toward this latter vision of worker education as being primarily centered on training for class struggle. And even very importantly, beginning to do it right now. You don't have to wait. Commonwealth College was going to become a big player in Southern labor politics. That was the idea.
And I just wanted to note this too as sort of a side note, but I do love the name that they call themselves, the Commoners, which is just like a good, kind of Americanism.
Peter Linebaugh signs his emails of Commoners All, and I want to adopt that. I love that. Yeah.
I love that. And a note on that is that it is very sort of Debsian flourish, the name Commonwealth. Not that other socialists haven't used Commonwealth. I mean, it's been a term that it's been used, but the Debsians always talked about the sort of universal Commonwealth as being the future, the post-capitalist future, the socialist future. So yeah, it's both tongue in cheek, like we're just ordinary folk, and also like a strong, rich American Debsian tradition speaking through that term.
No, it's yeah. So So, I mean, in this moment, right? And unless we're missing anything, definitely let us know. But, there's these struggles between the way that things are being taught, but there's also the question of the relationship to early Communist Party, correct? And that, I think, along with like the racial, tensions and questions about integration and equality, that really starts to draw the attention of a lot of opponents of the Commonwealth College. To this project.
Yeah, let's sort of go through this in order. So first things first, Lucian Koch sort of remakes the college in precisely the image of what I was talking about a moment ago. And things are going well. They have got a whole new classes, some faculty who are more on board with this vision, and they're starting to do things like send delegations to help out on picket lines. And Commonwealth students would go to like Harlan County, Kentucky, and like come back bruised and bloody. In fact, Lucian Koch himself went on that particular excursion and came back with like busted up faces and say like, this is what we do. Like, we don't just learn here, we go out and we strengthen picket lines all around, right? All around Arkansas and all around the South. They even went all the way up to Illinois, I think. Wow. So they were starting to like provide, their idea was that they were going to provide bodies and organizing talent and actually be key allies in labor struggles. So things are going pretty well on that front. But there's a hitch, which is that so when they do that, they get more of a reputation in class struggle circles. Militant socialist circles, especially in New York, also Chicago, a couple other places. So the city socialists start to get excited and they start to come down. What's happening, though, is that they're coming from places where there is now an established Communist Party presence, and they are used to a certain style of. They're coming from worlds at this point that are like, some of them would have been coming from places where they only knew socialists of all different types. And it was common to just pound on the table and fight with socialists, right? So they're bringing a kind of factional style with them that is not indigenous to Commonwealth. Commonwealth is a place where occasionally someone tells you not to wear shorts and you get mad at them, but otherwise it's mostly, picking berries and, reading Upton Sinclair. So this becomes a problem because the Communist Party members and communist sympathetic students start to feel that the college should not be nonpartisan. The college has always been nonpartisan and it's not been affiliated, and they want the college to affiliate with the Communist Party. So that's one big problem. And another problem is that they are starting to push on the racial integration question. And Lucian Koch, who's grown up there his whole life, he's been around that debate his whole life. He knows for a fact that has always been a priority for the college, but people are trying to proceed in a way that's sort of safe and intelligent and won't result in either people getting hurt and killed or the just destruction of the college, or both. He starts to feel quite offended because they are calling him a racist because he's not moving fast enough on integration. They're also referring to him, they're getting angry at him, and they're referring to him as a boss. And they're evoking the class struggle dynamic to describe the student administrator dynamic, which is incredibly frustrating to Lucian Koch because he is not a boss of anything. He grew up at Commonwealth College. He was raised by socialists, and he has a black eye from coming back from, Harlan, Kentucky on a picket line just right now. So like, what are you talking about? So this is tensions are really starting to mount. And unfortunately, on top of that, they come again to the attention of conservatives in Arkansas who are not happy with their work going out and, organizing with Black sharecroppers, which is mixed, that is a racially integrated activity. And it brings them to the attention of Arkansas conservatives once again, which is just not a good time because there's already factional stuff happening on Commonwealth. And now they've got pressure from the outside. So stuff is really intensifying during that period.
And, this chapter of this story is very frustrating, to read through, because you do see this kind of like sloppy I mean, because it's not Marxism, but it's like, but this kind of like sloppy view of like structures, right? To call him a boss, for example, to view any kind of structure in a community as, necessarily like, a relationship of like exploitation, right? This is sort of taking like, a very vulgar kind of, understanding of Marxism into a place where I guess it's frustrating for me because like, this is a place where you would hope people would know better. Cause this is supposed to be like the radical college where they're really interacting with a lot of this stuff. But yeah. And then like, there's also, the relationship with like the local labor struggles too. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. This is really critical. Okay. So one of the things that is really hurtful to Lucian Koch is that when they're getting mad at him for not integrating the school fast enough, he feels that it's not being properly understood that he has actually formed the first relationships between Commonwealth College and Black workers in the South. And that is an appropriate first step, right? And so when we're talking about that, we need to talk about the STFU, which to our ears, I know it's STFU, but it's the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. So let me start at the beginning. So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is formed by, I want to say, I've already forgotten his name. Yeah, Mitchell. H.L. Mitchell, if I'm getting that correctly. H.L. Mitchell forms the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. He's a white man. He's a white labor organizer. And he wants sharecroppers in Arkansas to be able to organize the way that other workers would. And he understands immediately that it's going to have to be a multiracial union, which is going to be an issue, obviously. But there's literally no other way to do it because at that point, sharecroppers in the entire South, I want to say, are 60% white and 40% Black. So it is just impossible to do this unless you are building solidarity between those roughly equal groups, frankly. So Lucian Koch finds out about this and he's really excited because it's happening in Arkansas. And they've been traveling all over outside of Arkansas to provide solidarity support for labor struggles. But this is perfect because they want to be doing more racial equality work. They want to be supporting labor struggles in Arkansas. And they really want to be making relationships with Arkansas sharecroppers, in part because they want to have some of them as students, first white students. And then the idea is eventually Black students as well. And so, Koch goes up to Mitchell and he's like, basically anything you need, you just call me. I'm gonna rally the troops for you whenever. And Mitchell's kind of like, I don't know about you, because Mitchell is afraid of adding more burdens to this new union's troubles by mixing it up with the Communist Party, because they're going to be accused of, being race traitors. Already. And then eventually if they are also accused of like sedition and treason and like ties to Moscow, that's like a burden that they don't necessarily need, according to Mitchell. And he knows that there's a Communist Party presence on campus. And for the record, he and Baldwin of the AFPS, the ACLU guy that I was mentioning before, who funds Commonwealth College, he pressed Lucian Koch on this Communist Party presence on campus. They were like, I'm not sure if you really want this. And Lucian Koch, to his credit, despite having real problems with that faction on campus, defended their right to be at Commonwealth and said that part of the nonpartisan mentality of ethos of Commonwealth meant that they were not going to be expelling people for belonging to a particular party. So H.L. Mitchell calls, despite his reservations, calls on Lucian Koch and Commonwealth College pretty quickly because they start organizing sharecroppers and immediately they land in trouble. And so the relationship formed, Commonwealth mobilized. They sent workers out and it was like every faction on campus was united for the first time in like a couple of years because everyone was incredibly excited about this. And like they went out and they participated in these meetings. They helped organize these meetings between Black and white sharecroppers. And at some of these meetings, racist lynch mobs literally charged into Black churches with nooses in their hands. And they kicked most of the people out, and they actually piled some of the Commonwealth students into, and I want to say Koch, and Koch too, was piled into, a car and driven through the night with these guys holding a noose. I mean, they thought they were going to die. They were essentially driven over the county line and told to never show their faces again. Mitchell is very grateful, obviously, because Commonwealth really came true. All of that practical training and class struggle really came through. They were excellent organizers. They did a really good job organizing these meetings. They were very brave, which was needed at the time, and they were really good at navigating the racial differences among sharecroppers, because they had been talking about racial equality on that campus for a long time, and they were all devoted anti-racist, right? Unfortunately, Mitchell also learned that at one of these meetings, a young communist student had been, unbeknownst to everybody else, passing out Communist Party literature to Black sharecroppers. And that made him very angry, because precisely because he did not want the Communist Party to be involved in the STFU. It turned out that his fears came true. The press had a field day with the fact that there were communists involved in these interracial sharecropper meetings and all of this. So Mitchell doesn't really know what to do. On the one hand, he's like, I love these Commonwealth College militants. I need them. They're important to our struggle. On the other hand, the Communist Party stuff is posing a real issue. Did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to make a note to people who are listening. It's like, this is one of the lessons I just wanted to highlight here. Is like, this isn't like necessarily like a whole thing saying like, oh, here's how like the communists ended up ruining like a really good thing. Like, in fact, like a lot of people were showing out. No, I'm not saying anyone's saying that. I'm just saying so people are clear about this. It's a reminder of how effective anti-communism has been in United States history, at really derailing political movements that were, radical for their time and still radical today in a lot of ways. It was just a really effective way because not only, okay, you can shut people up, but then you create these tensions and these fractures within organizations and groups in moments that are already very, very shaky.
Absolutely. And I also want to add that the communist students at Commonwealth during this period, which is around like 1934, 1935, are the best organizers. I mean, they're the best organizers because they have training in the Communist Party and because they have a very, very clear understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. Now, sometimes they go overboard, such as, getting all excited about denouncing, people like Lucian Koch. But that is maybe, you could say, like an unpleasant symptom of what is ultimately a very positive set of political and character traits, which is just an extreme devotion to the class struggle and a lot of passion and militancy. And, that one communist student who was passing out Communist Party literature was also one of the students who was piled into a car and threatened with lynching and death for participating. So these are incredibly brave, incredibly dedicated people. They're not just annoying ultra
wreckers. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're just talking about what we're doing is we're trying to unearth the complexity of this moment without passing judgment one way or the other. I mean, my personal reading is that I think Lucian Koch was like a pretty, it was a pretty upright person and really tried to do the right thing. So you could probably hear that in the way that I'm talking about my annoyance with what appear to be the kind of factional struggles on Commonwealth College campus. But off campus, things get a lot more complicated because when Commonwealth is presenting a united front, they're very much strengthened by the presence of Communist Party students and Communist Party sympathetic students, fellow travelers on that campus. Absolutely. But the STFU doesn't see it the same way. And they are getting really uneasy about this. So we can move into the next chapter because I think that's a Sounds bridge, good. Right?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. So the next thing that happens is that they get back from these excursions with the sharecroppers, and everyone at Commonwealth is feeling great. They feel like they have found their new cause célèbre, and they are so excited to collaborate with the STFU. Meanwhile, H.L. Mitchell's on the phone with labor leaders all across the country who are telling him, don't do it. Don't get close to Commonwealth. Commonwealth is infested with communists. So he's not entirely sure what he wants to do, but the train kind of leaves the station without him because there are some STFU organizers who are very, very pro-Commonwealth. And some of them actually go to teach on the faculty. And then actually some students, some sharecroppers become students at Commonwealth.
Oh, wow.
So the relationship is becoming stronger and stronger while Mitchell is becoming more and more uneasy about the whole thing. Mm-hmm. There's a funny episode where Mitchell comes, well, I should say that at the same time, the students know what's happening. They start to suspect. At a certain point, they do kind of come to understand that Mitchell is uneasy about them, and then they start whispering about him on campus. Now suddenly they start talking about him like he's a traitor and a sellout. And he comes to visit Commonwealth thinking it's going to be a nice visit, and actually he ends up being chased off campus by someone shooting a gun at him.
Oh boy!
But it's a little complicated because it does involve somebody potentially thinking that Mitchell was sleeping with their wife. It was one of the SDFU members that he'd known for a long time, but it captures the general. Now there's a mood of
there's a lot of there's a lot of threads at this point.
There's some stuff going on. So so the honeymoon is over. Like Commonwealth at first was like a great love, and then they discover that it's unrequited love, and suddenly things start to sour on Commonwealth. And Lucian finds this very disturbing and sad, and he's also constantly getting denounced. And so he decides that he's gonna peace out. So he leaves. He leaves Commonwealth after basically being there his whole life, which I think was probably very sad. Yeah. I think it was pretty difficult. And you have to remember, these are real people. Like, they may have lived a long time ago, but they have, their experience of the world is not too different from ours. So when I read that, I mean, it seemed to me like that was probably like the end of a dream for someone who I think generally was trying to do the right thing.
I couldn't imagine, just leaving like the land too, because it seems to be so beautiful out there. Like, that's going to be emotional enough on its own. But yeah, boy.
Yeah, I think it was really tough. And it's also the very end. That is like essentially the end of any trace of Debsian socialism at Commonwealth. They bring in, so the STFU and the AFPS. The AFPS, remember, is related to the ACLU. It's this fund that is funding Commonwealth. They come together and they say, we're going to try to install a new leader who is going to be on our side, but is going to appeal to the commoners. It's really hard for them to figure out how to do it. They end up with Claude Williams, who's a preacher. And because he had been a preacher, because he's a preacher, they think, well, that's kind of a Commonwealthy kind of thing. So let's send him over there. He's also a member of the STFU and an organizer with the STFU. So they think that they can sort of have a good relationship with him and control him. What happens is that Claude Williams goes there, and in Polk County isolation, he comes to the conclusion that the Communist Party is the right path, and that, he's going to be a communist. And so they lose control of the guy that they installed to actually sort of suppress the communist threat at Commonwealth College. And now he's a commie too, right? The final straw is this. Meanwhile, there's more attacks ramping up from conservatives at the same time. And the AFPS and the STFU, there's like a bill that's introduced that's like an anti-sedition bill that targets the college in particular. And they go ahead and mount a defense, even though they're kind of uneasy about the college. They're like, we're going to show solidarity. We're going to send money. We're going to mount a defense and everything. But it's kind of getting hard for them to justify continuing to protect this entity, this institution, if it's going to be related to the Communist Party and therefore imperil them by association, because they're starting to feel the vice grip of anti-communism. This is 1937, 1938. We're starting to see what is eventually going to blossom into McCarthyism. So finally, what happens is this is the final straw. Claude Williams is meeting with another STFU organizer. Literally, I can't believe that it's just happenstance. Out of his coat pocket, tumbles a piece of paper. The STFU organizer picks it up, unfolds it, and sees that it is a letter to the Communist Party headquarters in, I think, New York, requesting funds for Commonwealth students so that they can go secretly organize within the STFU, because the STFU is too hostile to communists, so they want to take it over. This guy who found this piece of paper takes it to Mitchell, and it's just a done deal. STFU is like, we can't have anything to do with you anymore. I'm sorry. The AFPS, meanwhile, this is 1938. a new organization has been founded. It's called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And the number one organization that it has in its sights is the ACLU, which Roger Baldwin is the leader of. Baldwin feels that he cannot have anything to do with the Communist Party. So he withdraws his financial support very shortly after the SDFU cuts ties with Commonwealth College. The conservatives in Arkansas look up and it's like a gift. Commonwealth has been isolated. It has no friends and it has no money. It's time to go in for the kill. Suddenly there's passing bills about sedition, this and that. There's a conservative preacher who starts preaching fire and brimstone against the evils at Commonwealth. And essentially what they do is they fine it into oblivion. They start fining it for not flying an American flag, fining it for having a hammer and sickle, fining it for just anarchy, whatever that is. And they just, the college can't pay because they don't have backers and they don't have friends anymore. And they don't have connections to the labor movement and the broader progressive movement that can help them fundraise in times of need. They don't have access to the presses. They don't have access to the just infrastructure in the cities. And, you know, it's over. That's the end. That's the ugly end of Commonwealth College, unfortunately, is that anti-communism caused its friends to abandon it and then conservatives devoured it.
And and in a lot of ways, that's the death knell of so many really progressive and socialist and communist movements in that period of time. It's just, I don't know. It's just, when you read these stories, it's incredible how effective that was at isolation. And that's like the real power. If you can isolate socialist movements and working class movements from each other, they're very easy to pick off. I don't know how we're doing on time, if you have 5 more minutes or so, or if you need to run.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because I mean, so we look at this history, and I think that if we're sitting here in 2021, I'm just curious what
should you say amidst the like a number of scandals like CRT in schools, panic, you have like the residential schools and like what education means and like all like school. What is school in a society? I sorry to hijack your question, David.
No, that was like, essentially what I was going to say is like it brings up this question of education, which is critical for both political organizations, but also like as a class too. You know, what are the kind of lessons that we feel like, you know, what does this really highlight? This story? There
are so many lessons. I want to say, I'll leave the education piece for a second, but first I want to say that one of the main lessons here, it's kind of, I hate to do like a both sidesism or a pox on both your houses, but I do think that we have to take as instructive the self-defeating activities of the communist students at Commonwealth who made some crucial errors. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have been members of the Communist Party or that they shouldn't, you know, what it means is that like clearly you write up a plea to the communist, a secret plea to the Communist Party for money to help us to take over the SDFU right at the moment when the SDFU is about to drop you and isolate you from the labor movement already. I mean, that's just an own goal. Like, and there's a couple other things like that. Like I think driving out Lucian Koch with that sort of acrimony and factionalism, which was essentially over nothing and was clearly splitting hairs and demonizing just the closest authority figure at hand. I mean, I think those were crucial mistakes. But I also want to say that there were that the anti-communism was an enormous mistake here. For one thing, we can say that you know, the Southern labor movement, essentially all of the Southern labor movement, not just the SDFU, cut their ties with Commonwealth College, which meant that they were just giving up an incredible resource of militants at a moment when they actually needed that resource because anti-communism was going to ramp up. And guess what? It was not going to be isolated to people who were related to the communist parties. It was going to come down on labor. It was going to come down on all progressives. And they needed good organizers and they needed people who were dedicated to class struggle to help them weather that storm. And so they said no to the help that they needed at the moment they needed it most. Yeah. And ultimately, guess what happened? The AFPS collapsed. The SDFU collapsed. I mean, they were victims of the general anti-labor, anti-communist, broadly progressive sentiment that took over at that time. And so essentially they isolated Commonwealth for no good reason. I mean, it all came to naught. They ended up meeting their end as well. So that's instructive on the other side, I think. I want to touch on the education point. We've been talking for a long time. So listeners may like years ago, if you remember, we were talking about this pedagogical debate. Again, I feel like maybe it's a cop out to say like both and, but I came away from this thinking that both of the sides had incredible points. Like I think I probably went into it thinking that I would be more inclined, just because of my general political sensibilities, to side with the communist students who wanted to just only do practical training for class struggle. But when I was reading the arguments of the Debsian socialists about why you would give workers a liberal arts education, I did not find them to be, embarrassingly utopian or idealist. I found them to actually be like very well reasoned arguments for how you should educate workers so as to strengthen the class struggle. I actually have a quote that I can read you, which might drive that home, from William Zook, who was one of the original Debsian founders. Do you mind if I read that out loud?
Oh, no, I'd love to hear.
He said, "Workers' education is not simply vocational training as organizers, publicists, etc. It is not merely a matter of a year's or 2 years learning of pointers on organizing, publicizing, etc. Workers' education involves complete re-education of our thinking in terms of labor. It means education to a thorough understanding and appreciation of social forces and their manipulation and control of social processes in the interests of labor," which, yeah, I think that you do want your militants to be armed with that level of understanding, or else you can guarantee that they're going to be bested at every turn, whether or not they're armed with the best organizing practices, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for me, it's interesting because I came into it with like the opposite expectation that I was going to be just because like, growing up poor in the South, like, from a family that didn't have an education, and growing up in a community where people really weren't educated around me. I always felt like, this is something that we need to claim and to help us understand what's going on around us. And I think about that, like in periods of my younger life, like people being able to touch on things that were happening around them, but without that general context that you get from, general education, liberal arts education, not knowing it. But then I'm on the, from reading this story too, you realize that, man, well, this college really became critical and important because it produced so many amazing militants. And I don't know. I know it's annoying to give the both and answer. I mean, hopefully the solution would be to find some proper synthesis between these two things, because we see this argument all the time. And it's, for the most part, it's fairly trivial, right? Where people have this argument, it's like, oh, should we do practical education or should we do like theory education? And you get this one side that says, well, we shouldn't tell people that they have to read 10 books before they can come to a meeting. It's like, well, yeah, nobody's saying that. In my opinion, I think that's like very much a straw man argument. But then too, there are people who like, if you're somebody who's interested in big theories and history and things like that, you can spend all of your time doing it. And if you convince yourself that that's the radical activity that you need to do instead of participating in social struggle, right, that's also delusional. And I think this really shows in clear terms, like how these things actually, affect the real world and like our kind of struggles. And I don't know, they bring these questions to life instead of just these kind of more absurd, abstract questions, the way that most of the time we deal with this political education question.
I don't know. And I don't know if you guys felt this way reading the piece, because I was hoping to impart something that I really got from doing the research, which is just, it's populated by people whose mental processes are quite similar to ours. Like I felt very close to all of the characters in this story. I felt like they could be alive today. They could be in our movement today. So I think it's worthwhile to just read about history and read about the individuals involved in history so that you don't abstract it and end up, dismissing a side in a debate that was frankly animated by people every bit as intelligent and every bit as devoted as you on both sides, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And that's a perfect sort of place to leave it off. Thank you so much, Meagan. I really appreciate you joining us. And I think this is your first go with us here at Left Reckoning. So welcome, and hope to have you again sometime soon.
It was a pleasure. I'll come back. I've been trying to convince Bhaskar Sankara to let me write more history stuff. So if you guys
that's perfect. Well, we love that.
Keep your eyes peeled. Yeah. And I'll come on and talk about anything you want. So, all right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Meagan.
Bye, guys.